Everybody loves a good Easter egg in a movie, which is a subtle allusion or detail or connection between the movie that you're watching and something wider in pop culture, or a reference to another movie, either in the same series of movies or in the wider canon of movies in general. And they're fun. They're fun to pick up on. It rewards an attentiveness to detail, and it rewards an awareness of things that are beyond the story that you're watching. I saw a particular Easter egg that was brought to my attention in the final film of Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises, where the main villain, Bane, this massive, imposing figure, watches the city of Gotham devolve into chaos and destruction while he calmly knits. And you don't really notice it your first pass through the movie, but then you start to look and you're like, why is this guy always knitting? And this detail, come to find out, is a connection to the book A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, which Nolan, the director of the Batman movies, says was a huge influence on his scripts. And there's a character in A Tale of Two Cities who knits while sentencing people to death. And so there's this contrast of this calm, quaint activity with the utter destruction happening around. And Nolan does this through this connection between this detail to cue the audience in, to say, if you want to go deeper into the story of The Dark Knight Rises, you need to read Dickens' book, because that will give you an insight through various connections into the symbolism, the development, and the tension and the drama of the story that you're watching before your very eyes. In a similar way, the author of Esther uses careful allusions in order to place the narrative within the wider scope of the Bible. So the dialogue, the decisions, the dramatic moments introduced in particularly Esther chapters 3 to 4 pull on the narrative threads of the entire Old Testament. And it underscores the unchanging and sovereign goodness of God toward his people. In a sense, as one theologian notes, the Old Testament reads itself. That history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it does rhyme. And in tracing those rhymes, we get a deeper sense of God's working behind the scenes to bring all things together for those who love him. This is Understanding Esther. In Esther chapters 1 and 2, King Ahasuerus, who's the ruler of the vast Persian Empire, banishes Queen Vashti for defying him, which exposes the foolishness of Persian power and also sets the stage for Esther's rise. She's a Jewish orphan raised by Mordecai, her uncle, and she's told by her uncle to conceal her identity as she wins the king's favor and becomes the queen of Persia. And her name is a play on the Hebrew word for hidden, because her identity as a Jew is hidden, but also the providence of God is hidden in this story as well. And so Mordecai uncovers a plot against the king, and that foreshadows a future deliverance to come. So he shows his loyalty to the king, and through Esther, that plot against the king's life is foiled. And the characters we meet, King Ahasuerus, Esther, Mordecai, there's a moral ambiguity to it all. There's some political satire based on the details of the opulent and self-indulgent feasts that are thrown by the king. But there's also, again, God's quiet sovereignty in the background, preserving his people even through the sins of others, the imperfect lives of the characters in this story. In Esther chapters 3 and 4, the main villain of the story, Haman the Agagite, urges the king to issue a decree calling for a widespread massacre of the Jews in response to Mordecai refusing to pay him homage. Right? Haman is this proud character. He wants people to honor his high stature in society. And when Mordecai refuses to do that, he takes it very personally. Reminds me of in the Michael Jordan documentaries, when anybody slights Michael Jordan, he goes, and I took that personally, right? Well, this guy's got a big ego, Haman. And then in Esther chapter 4, Mordecai goes to Esther and calls her to risk her life by calling the king to annul this decree to kill all the Jews in the Persian empire. He's effectively saying to Esther, you need to use your power and risk your life to save your people. And so we're going to look at those two scenes. Haman's plot to kill the Jews in Esther 3, and then Mordecai's plot to save the Jews in Esther chapter 4. Let's look at that first section, Haman's plot to kill the Jews. Chapter 3 introduces Haman as the final main character, and it sets up the main problem of the entire story, this royal decree calling for the massacre of the Jews in Persia. So the king elevates Haman above all the officials, but Mordecai refuses to bow to him, and Haman's enraged by that. He's got this insatiable fury at this sign of disrespect. And so he plots not just to take out Mordecai, but he wants to massacre his entire people. And he offers a large sum of money to make sure that that happens. And so the king authorizes Haman with his ring, and the scribes issue this edict to all the provinces and set a date for the destruction of the Jewish people, which leaves the entire city of Susa in confusion and fear. There's a couple questions that come to the surface as we read this narrative. Why does Mordecai refuse to pay any respect to Haman? And why does Haman seem to respond in such a disproportionate way to this offense? Let's think about these questions. Why is Mordecai refusing to bow? Well, some commentators say that he was wrong to do that. He should have bowed. He was being proud and arrogant. Others say that this was maybe a call to idolatry, and Mordecai was being a faithful Jew. I don't know if I'm persuaded of either of those. There are a couple other ways to explain this, I think, give a better understanding of why Mordecai does this. First, Haman is an Agagite. So he descends from Agag, the Amalekite. The Amalekites were a group of people, of pagans, who attacked Israel on their way to the Promised Land. So there's a lot of bad blood there. And also, famously, Agag, the king of the Amalekites, is hacked to pieces by Samuel the prophet. Now, if you remember, God actually commanded King Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, to kill King Agag and not to plunder his kingdom. Well, Saul does the opposite. He plunders the kingdom and actually spares Agag, and so it's left to the prophet Samuel to handle his business. And so there's this long-standing enmity between the line of Agag and the line of Benjamin. And so Mordecai is a Benjamite. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. And now he's encountering a descendant of Agag. And so there's already this animosity between these two lines. And so perhaps knowing that, Mordecai refuses to bow to the enemy of his great ancestor. And he doesn't want to show the mercy that Saul did, and Saul was judged for that. Another way of looking at this is, and some commentators, this is their speculation, is that Mordecai knows that Haman's making a play for the throne. That Haman is saying, I want everyone to pay me respect. I want to raise my social profile in the hopes of one day ascending to the place that King Ahasuerus currently occupies. And this would mean that Mordecai's refusal to bow is actually a sign of loyalty to the king. Now, there are a lot of allusions to the story of Joseph, right? Of a Hebrew in a foreign land rising to power because he shows his consistent loyalty to a pagan king. And here, there might be an allusion to Joseph refusing to sleep with Potiphar's wife. Potiphar is Joseph's Egyptian master, and his wife tries to seduce Joseph, and Joseph shows his loyalty by turning away from that temptation. And he's elevated to a position of authority. Well, Mordecai might be doing the same thing. Mordecai's already shown his loyalty by foiling a plot against the king's life. And now here, he's saying, I'm not going to bow down to this false king. I'm going to honor the authority that you have. And so he's refusing to play Haman's political game. He doesn't want to be part of this political ploy as a sign of his fidelity. In either case, it seems that the main point is Haman's murderous rage. The way that he responds to this slight tells you a great deal about his character. He's got a very, very fragile ego. he seethes with fury at what Mordecai has done or refused to do in his presence, and yet he doesn't lay a hand on him. He actually tries to do something a little more subversive. He tries to have his guys reason with Mordecai, and when they do, Mordecai doubles down and refuses to bow again, and then he reveals his Jewish identity. Again, that might hint at the reason for not bowing being tied to the ethnic strife between the Amalekites and the Israelites. But again, why does he have this disproportionate response? Well, it seems like he doesn't want to seem petty. Haman is very concerned about outward appearances. And so if he's, quote unquote, triggered by this inferior not bowing to him, that's not going to look good for him. So instead, he says, why don't I just work behind the scenes and try to get a royal decree out to kill all the Jews, and Haman will be, or rather Mordecai will be one of them. So he's trying to politic his way into seeking vengeance and repairing his very fragile ego. And so he goes to the king and he brings up these charges against the Jews. He says that they're sprinkled among the people, they don't assimilate to the culture, they don't follow your laws, which they're half-truths. The Jews are preserving their faith within a foreign world, or at least they're preserving the practices, and they do try to be distinct. But they're not disobedient, right? To this point, there's no sense in which they're trying to rebel. And again, Mordecai actually shows his great loyalty to the king. But Haman is trying to twist the story. He's trying to construct a particular narrative, and he's trying to say, look, let me put some money towards this. Let me get this problem off of your hands. Let's have this group of people dealt with. And the king, he's just characterized as this easily persuaded, dumb kind of guy. I mean, he's just like, all right, if that sounds good to you, let's do it. And it's the Persian king isn't really viewed as this shadowy emperor-like figure who's incredibly conniving and working all the levers behind the scenes. He kind of just goes with what people tell him, and he goes with his passions, and he doesn't seem like a guy who totally knows what he's doing. And he's easily manipulated. He's manipulated by his own court. Now he's manipulated by Haman, and he's actually very open to persuasion by Esther. And so the king serves a very unique function, right? He's kind of tossed to and fro by the different people talking to him. So he goes along with Haman's request. He issues this decree, and the city of Susa falls into panic, while the king and Haman enjoy a glass of wine. What a contrast, right? People are hearing about this massive killing about to take place in a year, and they clink their glasses and sit calmly. You see the juxtaposition. You see their callousness and their foolishness on display, that they could do something and issue something so evil and just enjoy, some fine dining and a drink. And to underscore the tension of this narrative, Haman is casting lots month after month, deciding when he's going to actually execute this plan. And it's as if to say the fate of God's people rests on chance, on the casting of lots, on the casting of Pur, which is where you get the festival of Purim, which is really the point that Esther is heading towards. So keep that in mind. But the question at the end is, you've got this crazy king and this evil man conspiring against God's people. They're enjoying food while they send out this murderous decree. And you wonder, is chance and fate really what's in control? Where is God in this? Well, we start to see that in chapter 4, where Mordecai goes to Esther, and you can see the working of God's sovereignty in the background. They're the ones who are going to show that it is not chance that has the last say, but rather it is God's sovereignty, and that he is raising up Esther for such a time as this. So in chapter 4, Mordecai learns of Haman's decree, and he publicly mourns, sackcloth and ashes. He tears his clothes, he fasts. And Esther, who doesn't know about the decree, does know that something's wrong with Mordecai. And she finds out about the decree, and Mordecai urges her to intercede with the king. And he says, God has brought you up to this position of authority to do this. Now, she's hesitant because she fears death. She knows if you go to the king uninvited, you'll die, and that she's risking a lot. But Mordecai challenges her lack of action and says, look, God's going to deliver us no matter what. The question isn't whether God will be faithful to his people, it's whether you will be faithful to your people. And so he places it in her court. So Esther resolves courageously to risk her life, and she asks all the Jews in Susa to fast with her for 3 days before she goes to the king. And she famously says, if I perish, I perish. Let's look at some of these lines of dialogue. Pay attention to how Mordecai says to Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Now, Mordecai not only seems confident that God will deliver the Jews with or without Esther, but he also says that if she refuses to help, her and her father's house will perish. Now, Rabbi Foreman, in his book, The Queen You Thought You Knew, sees in this dialogue an allusion to Numbers chapter 30. In Numbers chapter 30, in verses 10 to 16, there are regulations regarding the authority of a husband to annul a vow that his wife makes within 24 hours. So if a wife makes a rash vow and the husband hears it, but he doesn't say anything, then the vow is binding. But if he hears it and he goes, no, let's cancel that within a day, then her vow is canceled and she's not bound to it. Now, Mordecai seems to play on this idea by saying to Esther, you can annul this decree by speaking. But if you remain silent, the decree will be binding and you will be responsible for that. You can use your authority to save your people. You can, in a reversal, you can actually annul the word of your spouse, the king. But if you refuse, one, God will still save his people in another way. But you will face his judgment. You will not be spared. And so the stakes are high. Your silence will be regarded as a refusal to act righteously. So she's caught between a rock and a hard place. If she risks her life entering the court of the king uninvited, that's not a good fate. But if she chooses to remain silent, then she will also lose her life. Very difficult situation. And it's complicated by the fact that she straddles the line between two worlds. I mean, we get her Hebrew name and we get her Persian name, whereas we only get Mordecai's Jewish name. You know, Mordecai's singularly focused on his Jewish identity, but Esther represents two worlds. And so she has to work her way with prudence and cunning in the system that she's in to try to bring about the deliverance of her people, while also honoring the position that she is in. And that's going to play out in the next couple chapters. Another allusion that Rabbi Foreman brings to the forefront centers around Esther's courageous words. If I perish, I perish. She resolves to meet the king. She resolves to risk her life. And she says, if I perish, I perish. Foreman notes that there's a tight linguistic connection to Jacob's words in Genesis 43:14, when he says, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. That doubling of words is very unique, and that's what connects these two lines together. Now, in Genesis chapter 43, Jacob reluctantly sends his sons, including Benjamin, back to Egypt to buy food during the famine. This is devastating for him because Benjamin's basically all he has left. And so he prays that God would grant them mercy before the Egyptian ruler that they're going to meet. Now, he doesn't know at that time that the Egyptian ruler is actually his other lost son, Joseph, and now he's sending the rest of his sons out. And so he resigns himself to whatever loss may come. You know, I might lose my final son, and it is what it is, so to speak. But there's a courage to him. He's like, I'm going to trust God, go forth and go do this thing. And then Judah steps up as the one who guarantees the safety of Benjamin. Now remember, in Esther, Mordecai is of the tribe of Benjamin. And now the roles are flipped. The descendant of Benjamin is now interceding for the sake of the Jews, which is a derivative of the word Judah. So Judah, who was the one who brought safety to Benjamin, is now the one being saved by a descendant of Benjamin in Mordecai. And this connection is really intentional because it's showing that God continues to bless his people despite their time in exile. He has not forgotten their connection to the past. And not only does this strengthen the Esther, Mordecai, Joseph connection of someone being raised up in a foreign nation to a place of power and able to effect great deliverance, but it also cues in the reader to the way that God sovereignly works through history. It's not chance that controls all things. It's not the casting of lots. It is the sovereign will of God. It is the good and gracious redemptive plan of God, despite all the twists and turns we encounter in life. So the God of Benjamin, the God of Judah, of Esther, and of Mordecai is also our God. And that's what makes this more than just fun analysis of a story, though it certainly is that. It draws us in to say, that's the God we pray to. That's the God who calls us to the same courage that Esther demonstrated, and perhaps even to a greater degree, since we have Christ as our example. And we have Paul saying in Philippians, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." So there is a great confidence we can have, that we don't need to be afraid, that we can have the resolve of Esther to say that we will act, even in the face of an unknown future, knowing that God's plan is secure. He will deliver us. The question is, will we play a role in that, or will we sit silently on the sidelines?